I stepped into the backyard and the world seemed to pause, holding its breath in the violet Ojai dusk. Hundreds of paper lanterns, like captive moons, glowed with a soft, forgiving light. Crystals, suspended from the gnarled limbs of ancient oak trees by nearly invisible threads, refracted the candlelight into 1,000 tiny, shifting rainbows. On the meticulously raked earth, smooth, dark river stones had been arranged in a series of perfect concentric circles, creating a makeshift sanctuary. Around me stood the guests, a congregation of local influencers and wellness gurus, their faces wide-eyed and reverent, all dressed in flowing, cream-colored linen. Their faces, upturned and serene, were lit by the flickering candles and the gentle, ambient music of a lone cellist that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself. They had called it a healing circle, an energy rebalancing ceremony for new life, a sacred ritual to welcome my newborn grandson, Leo, into a world of peace and positive intention. I stood just inside the inner ring of stones, my hands clutching the worn, familiar fabric of my wool shawl, my heart a slow, steady drumbeat in the quiet of my own chest. My son, Julian, stepped forward into the center of the circle and picked up a sleek silver microphone. He was beautiful, my son, with his father's dark, thoughtful eyes and a carefully cultivated aura of calm, spiritual authority that he wore like an expensive suit. He cleared his throat, his gaze flicking for a moment to the ornate, hand-carved bassinet a few feet away, where my grandson slept, a tiny, perfect creature framed by a halo of flickering candles. "We gather tonight," Julian began, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that had captivated thousands of his online followers, "to create a space of family unity, of pure and unburdened love for this new soul." Then he paused. His dark eyes found mine across the circle. He lowered his tone just enough so that only the people in the inner sanctum, the true disciples of his wellness brand, could hear. "But to create that purity," he continued, his gaze now as hard and unforgiving as flint, "we must first clear the stagnant, negative energy. Mother, you're too bitter to be around the baby. Your very presence sours the air. Your history of pain haunts every room in our home." A hush, profound and absolute, fell over the circle. The ambient music seemed to fade away. The microphone, held loosely in his hand, seemed to tremble. I opened my mouth to speak, to tell him of the boundless, aching, unconditional love I held for him, a love that had fueled and defined my entire life, but no sound came. My throat had closed, a knot of grief and shock tightening within it. He leaned forward, a high priest delivering a final, unappealable verdict. "We love you," he said, the words dangling in the space between us like a hangman's noose. "But we need peace." That phrase, "we need peace," a modern spiritual euphemism for you, are the disturbance, stung like salt in an open, festering wound. Before I could absorb the full, brutal impact of the blow, before I could even form a response in my shattered mind, he did something I will never, in the years I have left, be able to comprehend. He flung the microphone toward me. It wasn't a gentle, symbolic toss. It was a sharp, angry, contemptuous flick of the wrist. The silver object flew through the candlelit air, a metallic blur, and struck my forehead with a dull, sickening thud. In that moment, I realized that not all wounds are meant to be hidden. A sharp, blossoming, white-hot pain erupted just above my right eye. I staggered backward, my hand flying to my face, my fingers coming away wet and warm and sticky. The microphone clattered onto the stone path with a sound that seemed to shatter the sacred, fraudulent silence of their ceremony. My daughter-in-law, Serafina, glided forward, her face a mask of serene spiritual concern, her hand outstretched, holding a wad of expensive, linen-like tissues. But instead of gently dabbing the wound, she pressed the tissues against my forehead and rubbed harshly, smearing the blood across my skin in a grotesque crimson streak, as if trying to scrub away an unsightly stain. "Don't stain the baby's vibe, Grandma," she said, her voice a low, cruel, conspiratorial whisper. A few of the guests, the ones closest to us, the inner circle, let out a ripple of nervous, complicit laughter. Blood, my blood, dripped from my eyebrow onto the collar of my simple cotton dress. I stood stock still, my body frozen, but my mind suddenly, terrifyingly clear. The world seemed to slow, the sound of the flickering candles becoming a roar in my ears. A single drop of my own blood slid down the bridge of my nose and landed, warm and heavy, on the back of my hand. That was the moment. That single warm drop of red. Inside the wreckage of my heart, a quiet, steady voice, a voice I hadn't heard in years, the voice of the no-nonsense ICU nurse I used to be, whispered a single, definitive word. Enough. With a calm I did not know I possessed, I turned away from the circle of serene, smiling, monstrous faces. I uncrossed the sacred boundary of stones and walked past the stunned guests, my head held high, the blood a defiant banner on my face. In my mind, a map of silent, unacknowledged suffering, a lifetime of it, began to unfold. Years of being gently erased, of being politely ignored, of brutal insults disguised as kind, spiritual concern. That microphone striking my skin, the sight of my own blood, it was not an injury. It was a refusal, a final, absolute refusal to remain invisible any longer. I found a seat on a dark bench behind a large potted fern, just beyond the circle of light. I drew my phone from my pocket and, with a hand that was surprisingly, unnaturally steady, spoke into it softly. "Alistair," I whispered to my lawyer, "activate the plan. Now." My lips pressed into a thin, tight line. The edges of their perfect, healing circle flickered with shadows. They would all discover soon enough that blood isn't just a symbol of pain, it is also a warning. There was a time when my hands knew the weight of hope, and it was always in the shape of a small, fragile, desperately ill child. I worked the graveyard shift as a nurse in the pediatric intensive care unit for over 20 years. My name badge was perpetually dull, my white shoes worn down to the very soul. My name, Annalise, often mispronounced by grieving parents and overworked, arrogant doctors. But my touch, they said, was unforgettable. My patients were the forgotten children from the dusty back roads of Arizona, underfed, underloved, fighting terrifying fevers in humming, beeping cribs that were too small for their suffering. I wiped their brows, I changed their IVs in the near darkness, I whispered lullabies into the cold, sterile plastic of medical tubes. Some of them made it, some of them didn't, but I always stayed. I would return home after the sun had risen, my shoulders bent with a fatigue that was more than physical, my hands aching from too many syringes and too little sleep. I would pour cereal for my own son, Julian, with trembling fingers, brush the thick, dark hair from his eyes, and kiss his warm forehead before crawling into my own bed to steal a few hours of fitful, dream-haunted sleep. I missed a lot of the daytime things, school assemblies, soccer games, field trips. I was always on shift, a ghost in the daylight hours of my own son's life, a creature of the night, of beeping monitors and quiet, desperate prayers. Once, in the 3rd grade, Julian came home from school unnaturally quiet. I was just waking up, the afternoon sun slanting through my bedroom blinds. I asked him how his science fair project had gone, the one about volcanoes we had stayed up late building together. He shrugged and whispered, his eyes fixed on the worn carpet. "Everyone else's mom came." Then, his voice even lower, so low I had to strain to hear it. "They asked me if mine was dead." I opened my mouth to explain, to apologize, to somehow fix the unfixable chasm between my life of service and his life of need. But I closed it again and just reached for his lunchbox, my heart a leaden, useless weight in my chest. That night, after he was asleep, I cried over a lasagna I had forgotten I'd left in the oven for too long. It tasted of char and a mother's unending guilt. Serafina came into our lives years later, a whirlwind of blonde braids, expensive yoga pants, and lemon-scented promises of a better, more enlightened, more vibrant way of living. When she and Julian moved in together into a minimalist house that looked more like an art gallery than a home, she announced, after her first visit to my small, cluttered apartment, "Your mom's home smells like old bleach and broken clocks." I had laughed politely, but something in her tone, a delicate, surgical, almost scientific cruelty, stayed with me. I had a small wooden music box in my room, a keepsake from my own teenage years. Inside, tucked away in a secret compartment, was a piece of music I had composed when I was 17. A simple, haunting lullaby I had called Sky Without a Ceiling. I had written it for the children I hoped to have one day, back when I still believed that tenderness could be recorded on paper and replayed on command. Julian found the yellowed, fragile sheet music when he was in high school, struggling through a mandatory music appreciation class. He read a few bars with a look of profound disdain and tossed it in the trash. I found it hours later, nestled amongst coffee grounds and pasta sauce and a milk carton. When I asked him why, he'd shrugged and said, "It's outdated, Mom. It's sentimental. It doesn't match the vibe of my room." I didn't argue. I rescued the paper, carefully cleaned it, folded it, and kept it hidden inside a first aid kit, tucked between rolls of sterile gauze and bottles of saline solution. When Julian was accepted into a prestigious private university, the tuition bill arrived like a freight train in our small, quiet life. He hadn't told me the full cost until the last minute. He was embarrassed, ashamed, but I saw the raw panic in his eyes. Without a word to him, I went to the bank and drained 2 of my retirement CDs, the money I had painstakingly saved over 20 years of night shifts and missed holidays. I transferred the $250,000 to a private educational fund I had set up, linking it to his school. I set it up anonymously. He never asked where the money came from. He just smiled, a bright, relieved smile that both warmed and broke my heart, and said, with a newfound swagger, "I handled it." Every time he landed a competitive internship, a scholarship, a travel grant, he would post online, self-made, no handouts, manifesting my own destiny. I would like the post, my fingers stiff with arthritis, my own smile fading with each click. I didn't need the credit. I just wanted the connection. But slowly, he was erasing the bridge between us, one success at a time, until I was just a distant, blurry figure on the shore he had left behind. And yet, I kept giving. Birthday checks he never cashed, small loan repayments for his car that I never asked for, bags of groceries I would drop on his porch during the pandemic lockdowns. I'd text, "Do you need masks?" and get a single, dismissive thumbs-up emoji in reply. The distance between us grew not in miles but in meaning. My home, once full of his crayon drawings and the lingering smell of late-night cocoa, became a place they visited only when they needed a quiet, free weekend away from the city. When they brought my grandson, Leo, to visit for the first time, they wiped down every surface in my apartment with antibacterial wipes before they would put him down on a blanket they had brought from home. Serafina once whispered to the infant as I reached for him, my arms aching to hold him, "Don't touch anything, sweetie. Grandma's place is dusty." I remembered when Julian himself was 6 years old and had a terrifying, life-threatening bout of pneumonia. I had slept upright in a hard plastic chair beside his hospital bed for 4 nights straight, my hand on his small chest, counting his every shallow, rattling breath. I had spoon-fed him lukewarm broth and wiped his nose with the sleeve of my own shirt when we ran out of tissues. Back then, my scent, my touch, my very presence, it was safety. Now, it was a contaminant, a warning of a life they had transcended. One Thanksgiving, Serafina brought her own gluten-free, paleo, keto-friendly stuffing and announced to the table, "We'll only be eating what we brought, just to be safe." She meant safe from my food, safe from my influence, safe from me. She didn't have to say it aloud. I wasn't invited to their gender reveal party. I saw the pictures on Instagram, professionally shot, with blue smoke cannons, a perfectly framed backyard, and 100 smiling, beautiful guests in matching pastel outfits. A stranger, one of her thousands of followers, had commented, "Where's the grandma?" Serafina had replied with a smiling, heart-filled emoji. She's not really into big parties. She prefers her quiet time. I was at home that day, a lemon cake cooling on the counter, a cluster of blue and pink balloons I had bought at the grocery store taped hopefully to my ceiling. No one came, but I endured. I endured it all because love, I believed, had taught me how to serve in silence. Because in nursing, in motherhood, you learn that you must often give much more than you will ever get in return. But there is a profound, uncrossable line between sacrifice and dismissal, between service and servitude. And as that microphone struck my forehead, the blunt, cold metal of my own son's indifference drawing blood from my skin, I knew, with the certainty of a final diagnosis, that the past could not be rewritten. But the future was a design that was now, finally, mine to create. I waited until the house was quiet, long after the last of the linen-clad guests had drifted away, their auras presumably rebalanced and their chakras aligned. The candles in the garden had been extinguished, the laughter and the soft, chanting music gone, replaced by the profound, listening hush of the Ojai night. I slipped silently from my small, designated quiet room, a room that felt more like a cell, and made my way down the long hallway that smelled faintly of lavender and old, cold stone. At the very end of the hall was a locked storage room, a place they thought I no longer used, a place where the remnants of my pre-Julian life were stored. I pulled my shawl tighter around my shoulders and, using a small key I kept hidden in the hem of my dress, I stepped inside. Inside that secret, climate-controlled room were the carefully preserved decades of my life. Dusty file boxes filled with my own medical research papers, unopened financial ledgers, a ring of brass keys to properties they didn't know I owned, hanging on labeled hooks, and old framed certificates of merit from my long and distinguished nursing career. I set a small battery-powered lamp on a wooden crate, and its soft, steady glow illuminated the shadows. I began to sort through a specific stack of documents, my movements precise and methodical. The deed to our family's mountain home, the title for a parcel of commercial land I had bought in 1998, the impressive certificates of stock for a company called EduTech Innovations, and a thick, leather-bound folder marked Annalise's Trust, Beneficiary, Julian Croft. I opened the trust folder. There, pristine and untouched, was the contract Julian and I had signed when he was 18, a condition I had set before I would release any funds for his expensive college education. It was a private document, one he had likely forgotten ever signing, tucked away in my desk drawer for over a decade. It clearly stated that if Julian, as the beneficiary, ever violated certain moral covenants, and I, with the help of a shrewd lawyer, had been very specific with the wording, toxic behavior, emotional abandonment, or severance of family ties, then full and immediate control of the trust and all its assets would revert to me. All these years I had been holding the key, and he never even knew the door was mine to lock. Next, I studied the EduTech stock certificates. Years before, when Julian was in medical school, I had quietly converted the $250,000 tuition fund into a massive block of shares in the then-fledgling EduTech Innovations. I had done it via a shell company I controlled, an LLC with the unassuming name of the Aurora Trust. The shares, as my research had predicted they would, had quietly, spectacularly grown in value as the company's mission expanded into new markets. Julian thought the tuition fund was his, a pot of money he could draw from at will for his educational expenses, which had lately included a Tesla and a retreat to Bali. I knew all along that it was still mine, cloaked under 2 layers of corporate ownership. He had withdrawal privileges. He had never had control. Beside those stacks lay the printed transcripts of text messages, Serafina telling her friends that I stained the aura of this home, that I was poison disguised as love. A file of Julian's messages to his father-in-law, "You deserve to be cut off from her bitterness. It's a cancer." And then, the video file from that night. The microphone striking my forehead, the flash of a guest's camera capturing the moment, the blood, the shock on my face, the ripple of laughter. I plugged a small USB drive into my laptop and watched the clip, feeling the sting of the betrayal once more. But now, it was not just a memory of pain. It was Exhibit A. My lawyer, Alistair Finch, and I had been working on this contingency plan in secret for months, ever since the gender reveal party. He had compiled a meticulous, devastating dossier of evidence: the trust contract, the corporate structure of the Aurora Trust, the text messages, the video, the stock agreements, all pointing in one undeniable, legally binding direction. The fund was not a gift. It was a loan, conditional upon his decency, and the contract had been materially, spectacularly breached. With trembling but determined fingers, I drafted an email to Julian and Serafina. The subject line was simple and final. You canceled me. I'm canceling your fund. You have terminated my rights as a mother and a grandmother in the most public and humiliating way possible. Per the contract we both signed on June 12, 2015, you have violated the moral covenants of our agreement. Effective immediately, control and distribution of the Aurora Trust and all its assets, including the EduTech Innovations shares, revert to me. Expect formal notice from my attorney. Annalise. I attached a scanned copy of the trust contract with the moral covenant clause highlighted in yellow, the stock agreement, and a single damning screenshot of their text messages about my toxic energy. I double-checked everything, my nurse's mind ensuring every detail was correct, every I dotted, every T crossed. Then, with a deep, steadying breath, I hit send. The war was no longer silent. The patient had been diagnosed. The treatment was about to begin. I awoke the next morning to a brief, concise message from Alistair. Notice sent. The control shift is effective as of 9 o'clock a.m. The board has been notified. I sat in my small, quiet room, my heart hammering against my ribs. It had begun. By mid-morning, Julian's curated, serene world had become a digital inferno. Alistair's formal notice, delivered by email and courier, declared, due to a material breach of the moral covenant, as defined in the Aurora Trust contract signed by your client, Julian Croft no longer has any rights to withdraw from or direct any assets held within. The legal basis was airtight. Almost simultaneously, his bank, acting on the legal notice, began sending a barrage of automated alerts. Withdrawal denied. Account access locked. Pending legal review. The automatic payments for his 6-figure medical school loans were declined. He frantically phoned the bank, but the representatives were polite, firm, and utterly unhelpful, citing a legal hold on the account. Next, I activated the corporate mechanism I had prepared for months. The controlling block of stocks in EduTech Innovations, held by my shell company, automatically transferred all voting shares directly to me, Annalise Croft. Julian lost his lucrative executive seat on the board. The emergency board meeting that afternoon, which he was not invited to, was brief. Annalise Croft, they were informed by a stoic Alistair Finch, now held majority control of the company. His visionary proposals were summarily rejected, his corporate access and company credit cards revoked. The empire of future education he thought he was building, the one he boasted about on his podcast, was now, legally and indisputably, under my name. That evening, I held my own event in the garden. My garden. The same lanterns, the same candles, but this time with a different, clearer purpose. I had invited local news outlets and a few select, reputable journalists. I played the video of the assault. I read aloud the emails and text messages, my voice clear and steady. The guests, real people from the community, gasped. Reporters scribbled furiously. The story caught fire. Social media hashtags, #MotherReclaims Fund, #SonLoses, Voice, #The Annalise Promise, trended across the state. Headlines blared. Elderly mother, abused on livestream, reclaims her power and her fortune. Son, silenced legally. Down at the hospital where Julian held a prestigious research position, a colleague forwarded him the headlines. Patients in the waiting room murmured, looking at him differently. Major donors to his research program, a program funded almost entirely by the EduTech dividends, began to pause their contributions. His credibility, the currency upon which his entire professional life was built, was in free fall. I stood before the cameras, a slender, determined figure in the glow of the lanterns. The wound on my forehead, now a faint pink scar, a mark of resolve. "They canceled me," I said, my voice clear and strong. So I activated a promise that was always mine. The applause was thunderous. Julian's world began to shrink. His professional contacts grew cold. His funding dried up. Serafina's followers flooded her posts with criticism and accusations. "How could you disown the woman who funded your entire life? How long until you lose everything else, Julian?" The court of public opinion, a court they had so masterfully manipulated for years, had sided with the quiet, dignified woman who had fought back not with wellness jargon, but with legal documents and irrefutable proof. That night, I walked through the halls of my home, the halls they had once tried to erase me from. And in the darkness, I smiled. I had reclaimed not just a fund, but my voice, my dignity, and my legacy. I did not sleep that night. Rain, a rare and welcome gift in Ojai, tapped at the windows, a steady, rhythmic drumbeat against my thoughts. Around midnight, I heard a knock at the front door, soft but insistent, desperate. I rose, walked through the dim hallways, my bare feet silent on the cold stone floors, and opened it. There stood Julian, drenched and defeated, his expensive umbrella collapsed in one hand, his eyes red and swollen, his tailored coat heavy with water. A flash of lightning illuminated his pale, drawn face. He swallowed hard, his voice trembling, a ghost of its former confident baritone. "Mom, I didn't know. I'm so sorry. Can we please restore the fund? I'll do anything." I stood there in the doorway, the scar on my forehead visible in the cold, unforgiving porch light. I did not invite him in. I looked at him, my son, and I felt not anger, not even pity, but a great, hollow, aching sadness for the boy he had once been. "You meant every word when you canceled me, Julian," I said, my voice quiet but firm. Behind him, a small, sleepy figure appeared in the rainy darkness. It was Leo, my grandson, in his dinosaur pajamas, clutching a stuffed bear. He squinted through the downpour. "They say Grandma is bitter," he said in a small, clear, innocent voice. "I say she is strong." At that same moment, my phone, which I had left on the hall table, lit up with a notification. Serafina had gone live on Instagram, her face a mess of tears and smeared mascara. Her voice, choked with sobs, broke over the speaker. "Mom, I was blinded by optics and fear. I'm so sorry." But her apology was playing to a divided and largely hostile audience. Screenshots of her cruel messages were flooding the comments. "Ungrateful daughter, your mother reclaimed her dignity." Julian's phone then rang, a harsh, demanding sound that cut through the rainy night. It was the hospital administration. "Dr. Croft," a cold, official voice crackled. "We've received numerous complaints regarding your professional ethics. We will have to formally review your contract." His empire, built on a foundation of appearance and my silent, invisible sacrifice, was unspooling in real time. I closed the door behind me, shutting out the storm, and invited them into the living room. Water dripped from Julian's expensive shoes onto the antique rug. "The fund is no longer yours to ask about," I said calmly. "Effective immediately, it will be renamed the Annalise Promise Fund. It will serve the children of the night shift workers, the single mothers, the forgotten ones in this valley who have no voice, no access, and no promise of a better future. Leo, as my first beneficiary, you will receive the first scholarship from it." I paused, letting the words settle in the silent, tense room. "You asked me to restore the fund. I restore nothing to you, Julian. I redirect it to others." Julian opened his mouth to argue, but Leo tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, stop," he whispered. That small gesture, that simple plea from his own child, echoed louder than any argument. Serafina sobbed openly now, her carefully constructed world shattered. Julian bowed his head, his posture small and broken. He finally realized that every act, every word, Every cancellation had consequences. "I want to rebuild," he finally whispered, looking up at me, his eyes pleading. "Please, let me help manage the scholarships." I shook my head, a slow, sad, final gesture. "No, Julian. You need to rebuild yourself first. This fund is not your lifeline. It is my promise now. A promise to the children like the one I used to be, and the mother you never truly saw." He and Serafina left by the front door. They didn't look back. Leo stayed with me. I tucked him under a warm blanket on the sofa and sat with him at the kitchen table. "They said I was too bitter," I whispered to myself as I watched the rain slow to a hush. "But I have made that bitterness into a purpose." I opened the doors of the old, dusty library wing of my home and turned it into Annalise's Financial Clarity, a free weekly class for older adults, especially women, who had never learned how to write a will, manage a small investment, or understand a trust. And in the months that followed, a new, unexpected relationship bloomed in my own life. Dr. Samuel Reed, a kind, gentle widower, whose own chronically ill daughter I had once nursed through a terrifying illness years ago, began to visit. We walked in the garden. We shared long, comfortable silences. One evening, he brought me a small, hand-carved wooden music box. He wound it up, and it played a simple, haunting melody. It was Sky Without a Ceiling, the lullaby I had composed so long ago. He had found the sheet music online, where my story had been shared, and had it commissioned. Tears blurred my vision. "You deserve every note you ever wrote," he'd said gently. I reclaimed my maiden name, Annalise Esquivel, a name full of music and soil and a dignity I had earned, not inherited. I was not just a mother, not just a grandmother. I was a woman who had endured and, against all odds, had bloomed. One afternoon, while cleaning out old boxes, I found a letter Julian had written when he was 9. The paper yellowed and the ink slightly bled. "Dear Mom," it read, "thank you for staying up late to make my costume for the school play. You're the best mom, even when you're tired." I folded it neatly and placed it in a small wooden frame on my desk. Not for forgiveness, but for remembrance. There was love once. There was truth once. I hope for his sake, and for Leo's, he finds his way back to it. But my own journey is no longer tied to his. I was once labeled as bitter, but I turned that bitterness into a legacy, and now into a new, quiet love. I am not a college fund. I am not a ghost in the hallway. I am not the wound on my forehead. I am Annalise Esquivel. I am blood. I am music. I am memory. And now, I am finally and completely my own.